Hey everyone, and welcome to a video where I talk about one of my favorite series, Yakuza. So one of the more interesting and controversial things the Yakuza games have done is decide to make their multiple playable protagonists in Yakuza 4 and 5. And honestly, I really like the decision. We get to see a lot of different parts of the world, and given how long each Yakuza game usually are, we get plenty of time for each character's story. Plus, it makes Yakuza 6 special when it decides to focus on just Kiryu. However, not every story given to a character is created equal. Some of them are the best stories in the Yakuza series, and some are so boring. And so I think it would be fun to rank each of these stories from weakest to strongest in my opinion. I don't really think any of them are bad, but there are definitely some that have a lot of flaws, and I'll do my best to explain why I put them all in each spot. To me, a good Yakuza story should push a character while staying true to who they are, and being engaging and fun while doing so. I mostly take story into consideration, although gameplay is still a factor in making these decisions. And these will go by parts, not chapters. And the final chapter where you play as multiple characters won't be considered. That's pretty much it, so let's get started with the weakest of these stories, which is Kazuma Kiryu from Yakuza 5. Yeah, this probably isn't what you'd expect to be the weakest one, huh? But, what even happens in this part? It's so slow-paced, and so much of it just is dedicated to random taxi drivers who are never seen again. They're fine characters, I suppose, but they just don't have much personality and are barely utilized. When it finally does get to the action, it's a generic Yakuza story, which is really uncharacteristic for the series. Now, I like the idea of putting some distance between Kiryu and Haruka and Morning Glory. That was a great idea. There's plenty of potential for growth and interesting plot lines that can result from that. But, Kiryu just acts like a dick all the time. It makes sense for him to be a bit cold given what happened, but the way they did it just strips away something that makes him Kiryu. The way he acts in Yakuza 6 after, spoiler alert, he temporarily loses Haruka, but he's still able to act like a kind-hearted man we know and love. It was just done way better than this game. It's a fine story, I suppose, has some good things in it, but it's not really a good way to start this game. Yeah, this is probably the one you would have expected to be my least favorite one. And to be honest, for good reason. This one definitely does drag on a lot, and when the usual format of Yakuza is stripped away as you just do whatever for 2 chapters, it can be really jarring. But if you look past that and enjoy the gameplay and story, it can still be pretty enjoyable. And hey, you get to control Akiyama soon enough. Akiyama is such a cool character, definitely one of my favorite in the series. Anyways, back to Haruka. At this point in the series, she actually started to feel a little one-dimensional and generic in my opinion, so seeing her getting the focus and actually growing was really refreshing. All her life, she chose to be selfish and put others before her, so this series chose to finally let her do something fun a kid would want to do. And at the end, it puts her love for the orphanage and Kiryu to the test, and that's a story that couldn't really be told anywhere else besides this series. As good as the story is, though, it does still suffer from a slow pace and uninteresting segments. Even after you get to control Akiyama, there are just a lot of parts that absolutely failed to get my interest. Bit of a slog to get through, but I think it's worth it and a decent addition to the Yakuza series. Honestly, I like Tanimura. It's pretty unfortunate that he's pretty much been forgotten, because he has such potential as a playable character. Finally letting us play as a cop in the series is such a good idea. His rebellious personality makes me have no choice but to like him. And his connection to Little Asia was a fun plot point, especially given the Jingwon Mafia from Korea and Snakeflower Triad from China were such big plot points in previous games. The thing that brings this section down, though, is the plot. It's fine, but this chapter just feels like it's all setting up the climax, and the character of Tanimura gets so overshadowed by the plot. I feel like if Tanimura had been pretty much any other protagonist, the plot would have been more or less the same, with a few details differing, of course, but still with the same plot points, which is the mark of a bland Yakuza story in my opinion, because it means the protagonist doesn't really matter. The gameplay is fairly repetitive too, and I wish it did more to stand out from the other chapters. Still though, the plot can still be intriguing at times, and Tanimura is a super fun character. Both of those things bring it higher than the Yakuza and Akiyama story that was before this. Why did I need to say that? Good addition to Yakuza 4, but compared to the other chapters, it's pretty forgettable. I love the Saejima stories. Goro Majima was sort of like Haruka in that he was getting generic and repetitive by Yakuza 4, in relatively. And then his brother Saejima comes in, not to only further humanize one of the most iconic Yakuza characters, but also to stand out as his own individual, and what an individual he is. That has almost nothing to do with the events of Yakuza 5, though, which aren't as good as the story in 4, but still really good. The story starts with Saejima back in prison, like what happens in the last game. It does feel pretty similar to it at first, but the way the prisoners interact with Saejima is still really fresh, and their bonds are actually surprisingly well explored, which makes the initial prison part very interesting, easily a highlight of the game. Saejima is a character who's already sacrificed so much of his life to prison, and seeing him back is heart-wrenching. And his expulsion from the Tojo clan, I know there's a reason for it, but he didn't know that at the time, twists the blade even further. But the connections he makes there and the hope they give him makes it really uplifting to see. Then there's a fucking bear in some village you spend way too long at, where they spend an eternity teaching you a B-tier optional minigame to progress the story, and then you have to play pool, which I lost at 5 times because I didn't want to spend money to progress the story, and I only won because my opponent sunk the 8-ball early. Some more boring stuff, and then the chapter has a really strong ending worthy of the character. Some of the highs of this part were the best of the series, but yeah, that middle part brings it down a lot, in my opinion. The first Yakuza story to not have any Kiryu in it, and it's a great start to the tradition. This is the point where the really amazing stories start, by the way. Akiyama is a great character. He's an absolute bastard, like pretty much every Yakuza protagonist. He's kind of lazy and from the outside doesn't seem to care much about his career, but once you find out more about him and his personality and he starts to interact more with Yasuko, he starts to be really likable. The plot is detached enough from the main Tojo clan plot of the series, while also still including it, which makes it a perfect story to start Yakuza 4 with, since a few of the stories have little to do with the Tojo clan in this and Yakuza 5. Akiyama's origin story of being a homeless man who got a new chance of life from the money that was scattered from the Millennium Tower in the original Yakuza, that was a really nice callback, and it means he has a lot of connections that make the story more interesting. The story has a slow pace and is boring at times, like all the other stories in the game, but it isn't too big of a deal here, and his relationship with Yasuko is very compelling. Incredible start to the concept of multiple character stories, and a great introduction to an amazing character. At this point in the game, I think I can speak for all of us when I say we all just kind of wanted to play as Kiryu again. Luckily, the wait was worth it, though, and we got a Kiryu-centric story that may not be as memorable as games that are specifically about him, but is still an absolute classic Kiryu story. At the beginning, Haruka gets some surprisingly nice characterization as she struggles to forgive Hamazaki. The rest of the story isn't too much new for Kiryu, but the people around him, like the aforementioned Haruka or Hamazaki, get really nice characterization driven by him. The story is very plot-driven, like Tanimura's, but I think it's done better here, because Kiryu at least gets to move the plot along in ways Tanimura didn't, and Kiryu fits much better into the conflict. Plot can still get pretty uninteresting at times, which, in case you couldn't tell from before, is basically a problem I have with the entirety of these games, but it feels more like the plot is actually going somewhere this time, so I don't consider it as boring as Tanimura's story. So, you know how back in the Yakuza 5 Saijima section, I sort of described pretty much everything I love about this character and why? Well, I was kind of getting ahead of myself there, because everything about that is actually introduced in this part. Saijima's story in Yakuza 5 has some serious issues with pacing and boring sections, but I can legitimately say none of that is here. In fact, I lied earlier. There is not really anything boring in here. All the good parts of this story are pretty much here, without the uninteresting stuff. For once, I didn't get bored. Saijima starts the story fully willing to kill 18 men, and doing so with barely any reservations. But after his time in prison, and after he thought he lost his brother, he eventually changes. The moment where he spares his enemy in the Colosseum might be a little ham-fisted, but it's genuinely such a strong showing of character development, and it's so powerful knowing what he's been through. I haven't really talked about gameplay yet, but that's also done really well here. It finds a perfect balance between the action and story-driven moments, which never leaves a dull moment. Saijima's story in Yakuza 4 is honestly legendary and so powerful. This is probably not a pick you'd expect either. From what I can tell, this chapter is pretty divisive in the fandom, but I think it's great. It's hard to describe exactly what this chapter does so right, but I think it feels like all the great qualities of the series put into one, with some more elements from the whole sports story. The story is pretty detached from the main events of the rest of Yakuza 5, and focuses on a lot of things that don't come up that much in the future, but I think it's done very well here, unlike something like Kiryu's chapter in this very game, because the characters are actually written extremely well. Who knew Yakuza could do that? This part pretty much perfects the idea of taking one of those signature absolute bastard characters and making you love them, and put them through a journey where they can show those likable qualities. Tetsuo Shinada is a man who, after being falsely accused of cheating in baseball, has completely given up on his dreams and is content with a comfortable life, writing for dirty magazines about the nightlife of Kenichio. Later on, though, as he learns the truth about the situation, he has to confront his past, and Shinada and we learn a lesson about sacrificing your dreams for other people. You could definitely make the case that this part retreads old ground, and yeah, I agree to an extent, but it also introduces enough new elements and personality to make it worthwhile. If only Shinada was handled as well in the finale. Oh well, could be worse. At least he is true to himself or whatever in the last chapter of the game. Yakuza 5 is one of the weaker entries in this series, in my opinion, but this part is not only the best one between Yakuza 4 and 5, it's one of the best parts in the whole series. Overall, Yakuza 4 and 5 have some incredible highs and some pretty low lows. Like I said before, I like the idea of multiple character stories. I think it was a great idea, but they definitely did drop the ball on some, and they suffer by the fact that they all need to be roughly the same length. But I've complained enough. Yakuza 4 and 5 are both amazing games, and hey, they're better than Yakuza 3. I mean, Yakuza 3 is the weakest in the series, but does have a lot of underrated elements. It isn't as bad as people say, but that's a discussion for a whole other video. The format of multiple characters, despite its flaws, still gave us some of the best written characters in video game history, and RGG Studios really knows the perfect time to make big changes to their series. From looking online and people's own rankings of the parts, I feel like this is going to be a little controversial, so let me know if you agree or not. Anyways, I want to thank you so much for watching. See ya.